Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us for the final part of this collaborative webinar series between the Classical Association and the Historical Association. It has been quite a whistle-stop tour over the past 4 sessions. We've really been throwing the information at you, and we are finishing this webinar series with a focus on the Ancient History GCSE specification. It is my pleasure, as always, to be joined by a couple of other panelists who will be leading us through today's session. I've always got Steve with me, and I've also got Alex, who is the Classics Subject Advisor for OCR, and Rich, who's the History Subject Advisor for OCR. Alex will lead us through the majority of today's session. But we'll all be chipping in as and when. And much like we have with previous sessions, please do feel free to pop your questions into the chat as you think of them, and we will pause regularly to pick those up. In today's session, Alex will cover how the qualification is designed, how the different studies, the different topics are assessed. Between the two of us, we'll also focus on the types of resources that are available to new teachers and CPD that is on offer if you are looking to begin teaching Ancient History GCSE in the next year or so. So without further ado, I will hand straight over to Alex.
Thank you very much, Grania. Just get presentation up. So hopefully you can see that. So I just thought I'd start by giving a bit of a background to myself. So I've been working for OCR for a number of years, 11 years looking after ancient history in various different roles. So I started off as a qualification manager, sort of the equivalent subject officer for GCSE and A-level ancient history. I then worked on the redevelopment of the GCSE ancient history qualifications a few years ago, and now my role as a subject advisor is to help support teachers deliver our classics qualifications, so including both GCSE and A-level ancient history. That this session has the same name as one of OCR's CPD events, but it is going to be slightly different. It's going to be a much shorter session than what OCR puts on as part of their CPD program, and it's going to be focusing more on drawing out the comparisons between our ancient history GCSE qualification and the various examination boards' offerings in GCSE history. So from the very ground up, really, GCSE ancient history has been developed to be very similar to GCSE history. That this stems from the Department for Education subject criteria, our approaches to the assessment of the qualification, and sort of approaches to teaching some of the content. That we saw the real growth potential in trying to align GCSE ancient history to the history qualifications as a real driver in encouraging more teachers to start offering the qualification. So as you can see from the slide, that just like GCSE history, students have to study 1 period study and 2 depth studies. There is a longer period study that they have to study, and this is in many ways quite similar to the thematic study that they have in GCSE history, although it doesn't cover the same large time span as the thematic studies in the GCSE history qualifications. That there is no historic environment requirement in the DFE subject requirements for the qualification, but there are listed in the specification some sites that students would have to study in particular components. So this is what we've designed with our qualification, given what I've said that must be studied in terms of a period study, a longer period study, and 2 depth studies. So we have created 2 equally weighted components. There's 105 marks in both papers. That in paper 1, they have to study the compulsory Persian Empire period study, and then one of the 3 associated Greek depth studies. In the second paper, they have to study the compulsory longer period study, the foundations of Rome, and then one of the associated Roman depth studies. That we have tried to make the qualification coherent, so whatever combinations of depth studies that you do with those period and longer period studies, that you have a meaningful study of the ancient world. I've also tried to design it to sort of help minimize the sort of the extra contextual information that you need to study, and I can give an exemplification of that in paper 1. So in terms of From Tyranny to Democracy, that covers a very similar time frame to the Persian Empire period study, although looking at a slightly different geographical location. There are links to the Persian Empire with the tyranny on Samos and also the Ionian Revolt. In terms of Athens in the age of Pericles, that this effectively continued on from the time that students would have discovered in the Persian Empire period study, that they'd have the contextual information about the Greco-Persian Wars to help feed into that, so that less time can need to be focused in on sort of like getting that contextual background, given that they've already studied elements that are linked to that in the period study. And then with the Alexander the Great depth study, that this focuses in on Alexander's conquest of the empire that Darius III had, so the last Achaemenid king. So understanding about how the Persian Empire was ruled in terms of the satraps, the royal roads, and things like that can help minimize the amount of sort of contextual information that needs to be brought in. There is a slightly greater focus in terms of the assessment, in terms of weighting on the period study. So that represents 27.5% of the qualification, whereas each depth study represents 22.5%. So if you have got between 120 to 140 hours to teach the qualification, as is recommended for a GCSE qualification, recommend about 33 to 38 hours for the period and the longer period study, and between 27 and 32 hours for the depth studies. I thought it also might be interesting for you to have an idea as to the most popular depth studies in terms of number of candidates taking it. So this is sort of approximate figures based on entries that we've had over the last few years, and sort of new centres coming on board and what we think they're taking. I think that whilst this might be a potential steer in terms of thinking about sort of like support networks that you could create with nearby centres delivering the qualification, I would really recommend making your decisions as to which depth studies you want to teach based on your own interests and what you think will engage and enthuse your students the most. So I'm just now briefly going to talk about how you would go about, at a very high level, sort of teaching both the period study and the depth studies and the differences between the two. So both the period study and the longer period study were designed to be taught in a very sort of history way, that the specification has the content laid out in a narrative in terms of key timeframes, and we expect teachers to teach the content as listed in the specification and then weave in ancient sources where they see it is most appropriate. That as a result of sort of taking this approach to teaching, there are no prescribed sources for the period or the longer period study. As we will see later, that the exam does contain some unseen source work. So we do recommend that whilst you're teaching the content laid out in the specification, that you do bring in specific sources with your students to help prepare them for the unseen sources or source in the assessment, but also help gearing them up to using sources, which plays a much greater role in the depth studies. So I guess a question might be, so what sources do I bring into my teaching? So we have produced planning guides for all of the different options on the specification. But for the period study and the longer period study, we have created documents that show how the specification content links to ancient sources. So if you're thinking about finding a particular source, you don't have to necessarily go to Herodotus or Livy yourself, but you can just go to the planning guides that we've produced and you can see where that's covered in the ancient sources. Within those planning guides, we've also sort of highlighted particular sources that we think are particularly useful to bring into your teaching. So that would be sort of certainly a first point of call. So in terms of the skills that we're looking for students to demonstrate when studying the period and the longer period study, that this is just an extract from the specification from pages 8 and 16, drawing out the key skills that we expect students to demonstrate. So I'll just highlight a few of them. So demonstrating understanding of relationships between different aspects of the periods studied. Studying continuity and change, analysing cause, significance and consequence of key historical events and the similarities and differences between situations, and demonstrating knowledge and understanding to reach substantiated judgments. So these all seem to me as sort of core skills that also assessed in any GCSE history qualification, regardless of examination board that you're teaching. I did say that there is an unseen source element in the assessment of the period study, and in the penultimate paragraph in the specification that I've got up on the screen, it states what we expect students to do with that. So learners are only expected to use details from the passage in conjunction with their own knowledge to answer the question. So what inferences can they draw out of that source, and supplementing that with their own knowledge to answer the question set. Given it's an unseen source, there will not be any expectation for learners to evaluate the source's reliability or provenance in those questions. So then moving
Alex,
on.
sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you here because we just had a question about those unseen sources. Kat has asked in the chat, with the unseen sources, are they generally written sources or are they images or visual? Is it visual culture? Or does that vary based on the period study?
So it's most likely to be a literary source. I think from all of the question papers that have been sat to date, I think they have been literary sources. The most recent paper had inscriptions from the Bickerton relief. Predominantly yes is the answer, but there can also be visual sources. So I don't think it's I think it's possible that you could have, say, in the Persian Empire period study, the relief, so the visualization of the Bickerton relief, or potentially some of the sculptures on the Apadana staircase as a stimulus to the questions that we have. I think on the Roman side, I think it's incredibly likely that it will be a literary source. Steve,
you want to come in here?
Yeah, obviously Alex is the expert from OCR here. The really good thing about the unseen source in the ancient history paper is that you aren't expected to comment on the provenance of the source or the reliability of the source. That's correct, Alex, isn't it? When it's an unseen source. So the sources that you see, you'll do a lot of work with them in the lesson with pupils, knowing about the writer, where the writer comes from, the writer's motivation, the writer's aim. But when you get the unseen source, you're simply picking up on the content of the source that you have in front of you, which reinforces what you already know. So it's a source about a period that you've studied in depth, but you're not expected to know who the writer is or comment on the reliability of the source.
Yeah, that's correct. I think that some students might do that, and if they're doing it in a way that's relevant to the question posed, they'll obviously get credit for that, but it's not sort of like a baseline expectation from students.
Thanks. I think that answers the question.
So then moving on to the assessment of the depth studies, the content is laid out in a slightly different way, in a thematic way, I think, just to help differentiate sort of it from the period study. The depth studies are designed to be a source-focused study on a narrower period of time, that we prescribe literary and visual sources that students are expected to have studied. And we expect the sources to sort of like be a central focus when you're covering the content for the depth studies. Again, I will just show an extract from the specification. So this is taken from pages 10 and 18 of the specification, just demonstrating the knowledge, understanding and skills that we expect students to be able to demonstrate when being assessed on whatever depth study that they have studied. So very similar to some of the skills already outlined for the period study, but also there is the expectation about the critical use of ancient source material to interpret, analyze, and evaluate historical questions, problems, and issues. And there's an expectation, given that these are set sources that would have been studied in the classroom, that students would understand the usefulness and limitations of the ancient source evidence and how this impacts the conclusions that can be drawn. So picking up some of the points that Steve just mentioned in terms of sort of the historical method, the aims of the historian, the potential other sources that they might have used to come to sort of a judgment. So in terms of potential suggestions as to how to structure your GCSE learning with your students, that I think the vast majority of teachers that deliver the qualification start with the Persian Empire period study. I think it's certainly the part of the course that I think a lot of teachers have commented incredibly favourably on, saying that it's potentially the most interesting part. So I think an ideal place to start before then moving on to the associated depth studies. I think some teachers then move on to the paper 2 content, starting with the Rome period study before moving to the Rome depth studies. But I do know of some centres that start the Rome paper with the depth studies before moving on to the period study. And as I think was mentioned in the Rome 101, that there is some content that requires sensitive teaching, and sort of leaving that to the end when students are slightly older, slightly more mature, to deal with some of those areas is sort of, I know that some centres have been doing that. So just given some suggestions, I know previous sessions also had recommendations for certain books that you might want to consider studying. So I decided to just give some recommendations for the Persian Empire period study for a number of reasons. One, as I've sort of just shown on the previous slide, I think this is the most logical place to start in terms of the content for year 10 students. I think also that certainly when we introduced the qualification, this was an area that quite a lot of teachers that had been teaching ancient history for a number of years perhaps felt less confident on. So I thought this would be perhaps a prime thing to sort of focus on here. So I, in particular, when I was helping sort of draft some of the specification content and also producing some of the resources associated with that, I found the book on the left, the Matt Waters Ancient Persia book, incredibly useful. That also have read the Tom Holland book, and I'm in the process of reading the Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones book. And I know from a number of other teachers that have read it that they recommend it very highly. The fourth book, the one on the right, the Persian Empire, by Emily Kurtz, is a corpus of sources focusing on the Persian Empire. But it is quite a hefty book, but includes a lot of ancient sources. So although there's no sort of desire to have to teach everything in the Persian Empire period study from sources, I think it's certainly, as a teacher, quite useful to be familiar with some of those sources. And this is sort of a book that contains the vast majority of the sources that I think you'd consider using in the classroom. There are other sort of like websites, and we can certainly touch upon those later, as to where you can find some of the ancient sources without having to necessarily buy some of these books. That within our planning guides that we've produced, and I'll talk about those a little bit more detail in the next slide or so, we do have recommendations for books that the students can read, but also yourselves. So moving on to sort of planning guides and the support that OCR offer, that we have produced these planning guides for all parts of the qualification, that predominantly designed to help support non-specialists, that have suggestions on sort of the amount of time to spend on the various different parts of the specification. As I said, include recommendations for further reading. As I said, for the period studies, sort of give information as to where you can find information about particular events, etc., in the ancient sources to help save you time. So these materials are currently available on the public OCR website, but also Teach Cambridge. And I think going forward, Teach Cambridge is the place that I recommend you to try and access all of the resources. So it's a specially built website that contains all of the resources that OCR have created to support the delivery and assessment of our qualifications. So it includes past papers, it includes exemplar answers, some of which are solely on Teach Cambridge at the moment. We've also produced freely available source booklets that contain all of the sources for the depth studies. We produce these in two different formats, so a classroom PDF booklet and editable Word documents. So I'm just going to talk through very quickly some of the features of those prescribed sources booklets, mainly the PDF classroom ones. So we've included in each of those booklets a map so that students can understand how the geographical places mentioned within the prescribed sources linked together, where those places are, that recognise that students' geographical knowledge of the Eastern Mediterranean, Asia Minor, might not be brilliant. So this is something just to sort of like help consolidate their learning and contained within the source booklets. We also include all of the visual material sources, and these are the sources that will be used if they appear on the question paper. And also, obviously, the literary sources that we have. As you can see here, we have a notes section that allow these to be sort of printed off and given to students to make their own notes as they go through the content. That in these PDF classroom booklets, the sources have been laid out in a way that we feel is most appropriate to teach the course. So in most cases, following the chronology of the events. So this is sort of like a one-stop shop that you can give to your students to help them sort of have all of their notes on the ancient sources in one place. We've also, as I said, created Word documents, so that you can sort of create your own resources from those. I appreciate sort of copying and pasting from PDF documents isn't the easiest. And in those Word documents, the sources are laid out according to how they're listed in the specification. So there are endorsed textbooks for the course, and I will add a link into the chat in a minute, from where you can sort of click on the relevant books and also sort of request inspection copies if that's what you'd like to do. I thought it would also be useful to talk about some of the third-party resources. So I think one place that I would definitely recommend you checking out is the Warwick Classics Network. So they have a number of resources on there to help the delivery of the GCSE Ancient History qualification and other classics qualifications. Some of that material includes lesson PowerPoints, so you can use and potentially adapt those, so you're not necessarily starting from scratch. And Grania will talk about some of the resources that the Classical Association have got planned. Just a couple of sort of places that teachers frequent. So there's the Classics Library, that coming from a history background, you might not be aware that this is a website that has sort of like a forum facility for teachers to ask questions and also share resources. So I'd recommend signing up to that. I'd also recommend signing up to the OCR A-Level and GCSE Ancient History Facebook group. So this is a group that has been set up by teachers for teachers and is not affiliated to OCR. I am a member, so I can sort of like see what's being asked to help sort of like inform my understanding of sort of like what teachers are looking for and questions and such like. But this is a good place for you to join. And if you are looking for sort of support or particular resources, that a number of teachers use that as a way of sort of upskilling themselves and helping resource the teaching of the qualification. That Persepolis Reimagined. So I think this is a link through to a US Museum's exhibition page that has 3D walkthroughs of some of the buildings in Persepolis that I think is a good way to potentially help your students understand some of the buildings there. And also sort of in terms of sort of upskilling yourselves, in terms of subject knowledge, that there's a number of in our time episodes that specifically link to content that's on the specification. So,
can I come in?
Yes.
Here? Would you be able to? We're currently looking at. We're not looking at your presentation. We're just looking at the sort of present. Well, the PowerPoint before it's presented, if that makes sense.
Oh, right.
Would you be able to share my slide if that's possible?
So what slide have you got on?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Thank you. So just to come in off the back of what Alex has just mentioned there about some of the third-party resources, I just wanted to draw on a couple of extra organisations which I have previously mentioned in previous webinars. At the CA, we are working hard to make sure that we're supporting new and experienced ancient history teachers, both at GCSE and A-Level, and we're currently working on putting together exemplar schemes of work for both key stages, as well as source books for A-Level. And we also have a podcast series that supports the A-Level specification. We have also hosted a number of ancient history teach meets this year, and you can find the recordings to those over on YouTube, and they've offered some really insightful tidbits from teachers in terms of the way that they teach particular topics, but also some of the platforms and the websites that they use throughout their teaching. And we're also planning an Ancient History CPD Day, which will be an online event, and that will be happening during the academic year of the next academic year. What Alex he's mentioned a couple of times about communities and and local networks. There's a very strong ancient history community, and that's sort of driven by our subject advisory team and the team lead, who is James Renshaw, who has been involved, hugely instrumental in the last round of reform and the development of the textbooks. And so if you are new to teaching and would like to be put in touch with other schools who are teaching similar modules to you, that is something that we can facilitate. That actually sort of links into, I saw a question that popped up in the chat from Pantelis about whether you can teach one period in one depth in year 10 and then another one in year 11. And I think although that is an excellent model to work towards, I think actually if you are able to sort of save some time at the end of year 10 to introduce a new period study that then carries through the summer work to save yourself a bit of time for revision in year 11, that might be preferable. But schools do that very, very differently. And actually, if you would like support in thinking about which way to teach the modules, we can put you in touch with a number of different teachers who might be able to offer their advice and share their schemes of work with you. Alongside the CA, we also have Classics for All. They have most of their resources at the moment focused on the lower key stages, but they do offer free CPD that pops up. Some of that has been focused on ancient history, and they have very good local networks, particularly up in the north. There's a very strong network of ancient history teachers in the north. So if you are a teacher in the north, then we can put you in touch with them. And if it is at a point where you are now looking to introduce ancient history and you would like to buy classroom sets of those textbooks that Alex has previously mentioned, the Roman Society offer textbook grants, and so that might be an organisation to get in touch with if you can't quite manage it out of your department budget. I think that was all from me, just on some additional resources. Steve.
I was just going to say, so primarily there you can see the Classical Association and Classics for All, but also for the first time this year, Gronya and I presented a session at the Historical Association conference in Harrogate. And I don't want to preempt anything, Gronya, but I think this is now going to be a regular thing. So for teachers who are members of the Historical Association and have perhaps never even heard of the Classical Association, then the Historical Association every year at the conference will be hosting a get-together for teachers of ancient history, whether that's ancient history at GCSE, as Alex has been talking about, or teachers of ancient history at Key Stage 3 who are trying to introduce some ancient history. So that will be a regular feature of an HA conference as well.
Steve, and sorry, Alex, for interrupting. If you'd like to carry on, we haven't had any other questions crop up in the chat so far.
Right. Okay. The purpose of the next few slides is to sort of give a high-level overview of the questions that we have in the GCSE Ancient History qualification, and attempt to show the similarities with the different types of questions that you get in GCSE history qualifications. But before I do that, I thought it would be useful to show the assessment objectives for GCSE Ancient History. And as you can see, there is quite a high level of similarity to the GCSE history assessment objectives. So I believe the AO1 assessment objective is worded identically to that in GCSE history. The only difference being that rather than being weighted at 45% as it is for GCSE Ancient History, history has that at 35%. Likewise, for the AO2 assessment objective, that is again very similar to the wording in GCSE history. Again, slight differences in the assessment objective weightings. And in terms of the AO3 assessment objectives, I think that the first 3 lines on screen are virtually identical to the AO3 history weightings or wordings. The GCSE Ancient History doesn't have an AO4 assessment objective, which sort of like deals with interpretations, but I think there are similarities that the vast majority of the ancient sources that we have prescribed in our GCSE Ancient History qualification were created after the events they describe, and them in themselves are interpretations of the past. So I think there are things in that second bullet point that's on screen that draws out some of the type of things that you would be looking at and assessing in the GCSE history interpretations assessment objective. So just sort of going through the various different types of questions. So again, as I said earlier in the presentation, that there are 2 papers equally weighted, 105 marks. That the specification at the moment says the timing is 1 hour 45 minutes, but we have heard from some centres that that perhaps isn't sufficient. So we are working on increasing the length of the exam to 2 hours. And I think other exam boards have found that. So I know certainly that AQA increased the length of their exam in light of feedback from teachers from 1 hour 45 to 2 hours. So as you can see here, 5 different questions in the period study, 5 different questions in the depth studies. So whilst the phrasing of the questions might differ slightly, as do the mark carriers for the questions, the aim is really to show that how the GCSE Ancient History questions are very similar in terms of what they're assessing to those that appear in the GCSE History qualifications. And I'll include examples of the various different types of questions that we have in the Ancient History qualification, alongside examples from different exam boards, just to sort of like make that point abundantly clear. So moving on to looking at sort of questions. So in the period study, the first question that students have to answer is sort of easy, accessible, factual recall questions. That these are designed in the Ancient History qualification to ease students into the exam so that they can pick up some easy marks to gain their confidence before moving on to questions that require them to demonstrate a bit more advanced skills. And so in terms of the GCSE Ancient History qualification, that there will always be in the period study 4 marks worth of factual recall questions. In terms of the second question on the paper, the GCSE Ancient History question will always use the command word outline and will always be worth 6 marks. And we'll be looking for students to write a written prose summary, giving details about a particular event or place or whatnot. So we've got examples from all of the 4 GCSE boards to show that they have very similar type of questions there. That, as our examiner reports say, that we're looking for students in this question to make at least 3 developed points. The next question that students will come across, so question 3 in the paper, is a source-based question. And as I was saying earlier, that we're expecting students to make inferences from the passage and supplement that with their own knowledge. The questions, question 3 in the paper, will use a set wording, so using details from passage A, essentially source A, and your own knowledge, what can we learn about, and whatever the question paper author decides to focus on. So it'll always be worth 10 marks. So as I said, looking for students to make inferences from the passage or source to answer the question, and then supplementing that or bringing in other information that perhaps contradicts that into their answer. As we can see from the Pearson example, that they do have some glossing, sort of if there's a word or phrase that they think that a student might not understand, they're sort of like given a definition just to help students. And this is an approach that we will also use in the GCSE Ancient History period study papers. I think our specimen assessment materials for the Persian Empire had sort of gave some contextual information about a particular individual that was included in the passage. And I think we've done that in a number of the papers that have been sat by candidates. So just one of the ways that we try and make this question as accessible as possible. The fourth question in the GCSE Ancient History papers is focusing in on a second order historical concept. So it uses the same unseen passage that candidates would have been answering question 3 on, expecting them to sort of making inferences from the passage, supplementing that with their own knowledge to address that second order concept. So I think this is fairly similar to the type of question that appears in the Pearson paper, where they have a second order concept question, and they're given a couple of stimulus points for students to sort of go off. But there is an expectation that they must use their own knowledge. So very similar in terms of sort of what we're expecting students to do in comparison to this Pearson example. That we'll also try to make sure that the second order historical concept that's being assessed will be as clear as possible for students. That the concepts are listed in the specification, and I can just sort of read those out. So continuity, change, causation, consequence, significance, similarity, and difference. So clearly assessing similarity here, just to make it explicit to students as to sort of what we want them to focus on. That sort of, as I've been saying, that it's sort of like a set formulae for the start of these questions, and the number of marks will always be 15. The final question in assessing the depth or the period study is an essay question. So examples from other exam boards, as you can see here, that there is 5 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. And this is the only place that is explicitly assessed within the qualification. So both the period study and the longer period study in paper 1 and paper 2. So then moving on to the assessment of the depth studies. Again, we start with sort of factual recall questions. So just an example from the Cleopatra depth study, but unlike in the period study, there are now 5 marks associated with this rather than the 4 from the period study. The next question that they will face is a source-based question. And because this is the depth study, they will have studied these sources in the classroom. That we use a set phrasing. What can you learn from source A, B, C, or about a particular event? Always worth 5 marks, and we're looking for students to make inferences from the passage to address the question posed. So as you can see here from the 3 examples, again, something that's readily assessed in GCSE history qualifications. There's then another source-based question, and the example that I've included on screen is from a different depth study, so this time from the Hannibal depth study. So having answered the second question about inferences, we then ask them to comment on how accurate they think the passage or the source is in relation to whatever the particular focus of the question is. And again, sort of using sort of information from the passage to link that to sort of potentially the historian's method, potentially other sources that they will have studied as part of the prescribed sources, to make comments on the likely accuracy of parts of the passage. So again, examples from Edicas, Pearson and OCR as to sort of how these type of skills are assessed in the history qualifications. The penultimate question in the paper that students are going to answer is a second order historical concept question. So unlike the second order historical concept in the period study, there is no stimulus material provided. So we'll be expecting students to recall the information and sort of create arguments to answer the explicit concept that's being assessed. And I think this is a question type that appears in virtually all of the GCSE history qualifications.
Alex, can I interrupt with a question?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I've had a question about the accuracy source-based question, so that's the one. Is it based on provenance and content, or just provenance?
I think it really depends, whatever you want to comment on. So it could be sort of drawing out a feature and saying, well, how would Polybius know about that? So might he have been able to speak to people who were around at the time? What was his historical method that might mean that this is accurate? So there's that type of element that sort of can be brought in, as well as sort of like comparing to what other sources say. But I think what we're really looking for students to do, sort of rather than just doing a generic comment on here's what I know about Polybius as a historian, linking it to specific parts in the passage to address the accuracy. That whilst that sort of like generic approach will gain some marks, for the higher levels that we're expecting it to be grounded in the ancient source and picking out features of that and commenting, I guess, however they think is most relevant to answer that question about accuracy.
You could choose provenance, or you could choose context, as long as you're linking it back into the content to sort of critically analyze what the passage says. Thank you.
So then the final question in the paper is a source-based essay. So sort of a couple of examples from both OCR History A and OCR History B as to sort of like how they go about it. I think there is sort of, in terms of sort of like the skills, very similar. One difference is that unlike the two questions provided on from history as an exemplification, that students are expected to recall the ancient sources that they have studied in the class and be able to sort of use that as evidence in order to address the question. So we're looking at them to sort of integrate the knowledge of the sources that they've studied, their own knowledge of the historical events, obviously focus that into an argument to address the question, but also comment on the accuracy of the info, or the accuracy, the reliability of the information they've quoted to help support that question. In this case, sort of Rome's success against Carthage in Africa were the main factor in deciding the outcome of the Second Punic War. So again, sort of the history examples focus on sort of like convincing and useful. The same type of thing that needs to be incorporated into the ancient history answer in terms of addressing the sources that they're using. And again, sort of, we're looking for the very highest levels for them to, as we were just talking about in terms of that source-based question on the paper, using the evaluation of the specific points that are made, rather than sort of just a generic evaluation of the author. So that's sort of a whistle-stop tour through the assessments of the GCSE Ancient History, and sort of trying to draw out the similarities between the Ancient History qualification and the history qualifications. So I just wanted to highlight that there are a number of sort of like assessment-related resources. Obviously, you can have a look at past papers, sample assessment materials, that we do have quite detailed examiner reports that include snippets of candidate answers to help exemplify some of the points that the examiners are making from how candidates attempted to answer certain questions. We do have sort of like call-out boxes identifying misconceptions that students seem to regularly make, and also sort of like assessment for learning points. So these are released on results day and will only be available on Teach Cambridge. We also do have exemplar answers. So there's on Teach Cambridge, the 2019 and 2022 exemplars. So if you haven't had a chance to look at those, I think it would be a useful point of call. Teach Cambridge also hosts some of our previous CPD course materials. So you can download those to have a look through the materials. I believe you can possibly also download some of the recordings of the free webinars that we have been running. So sort of that does link on to sort of some of the CPD that OCR have organised. So we haven't released our CPD programme for the next academic year, but historically we have been starting to teach webinars. So that would go into a little bit more detail as to sort of some of the things that I've been talking about. A couple of free Q&A webinars where you can bring any questions that you might have about the qualification. But we've also run exam feedback sessions whereby an examiner will lead delegates through looking at scripts and sort of like helping explain why the scripts got particular marks. I think that in an earlier section of today's session that Gonya's talked about some of the sort of like the CPD opportunities that the Classical Association have offered and will be offering. So that just then brings me to essentially addressing some of the concerns that potentially SLT members, head of department, head of faculty might raise about introducing GCSE Ancient History, and a sort of attempt to address those head on to sort of like overcome any potential barriers that there might be to offering the qualification. So I think the first thing is just to Ancient History GCSE is an EBacc subject in the humanities block alongside history and geography. But I think is a really key selling point for the subject, particularly for those in the state sector, that we've got the EBacc icon on our front cover just to make that abundantly clear to centres and prospective students and their parents. Something that was touched upon in, I think, the previous session, if you attended, was about how will introducing GCSE Ancient History impact the take-up of history. So I was having a look at some of the data that the Department for Education make available on their various different pages. So I was looking, so this research that I've just done was looking at those schools that introduced GCSE Ancient History in 2022. And this DFE data relates to schools only in England. So I had a look at the number of candidates that were entered for history, geography, and ancient history over a number of years to see if there's any sort of like pattern. So what I was able to find from this analysis was that for those centres that introduced GCSE Ancient History in 2022, the total number of entries for a history qualification, so that's ancient history plus history, increased by about 10%. The entries for GCSE geography remained stable. So I think quite useful information that you can sort of potentially use to sort of make the case that not only will ancient history sort of increase the total number of students studying a history qualification, it won't necessarily have an impact on those entering for geography. So it seems to be that it's drawing perhaps students that would not otherwise consider a history qualification to take ancient history. I think another sort of like typical question that I've had, and I was dealing with such inquiry earlier in the week with a centre that was considering offering GCSE Ancient History, and it's about sort of, are my students likely to get better or worse grades if they take ancient history in comparison to history? I'm just going to give a little bit of contextual information as to sort of how we go about awarding grade boundaries, and then sort of some work that I've done sort of like to directly answer that sort of question. So exam boards use, this is all exam boards in England, use the comparable outcomes approach to awarding grade boundaries. And the aim of this is to fix into the system the same amount of value added year on year for a subject at a particular level. So this is aiming to ensure that two successive cohorts with the same prior attainment profile will receive the same distribution of grades year on year. So a prediction of the grade profile for a specification or a qualification, so a subject area, so history, ancient history, is produced looking at sort of a national data from a benchmark year, and then details of the prior attainment and outcomes are listed in sort of like a matrix format. We then look at the cohort profile for the year in question and adjust that matrix to give a prediction as to how many candidates or percentage of candidates will get various different grades. So I'll add into the chat sort of a little bit more information about how we go about that, just to explain it. That was a very quick run through. So essentially what I've done is look at the ancient history prediction matrices and the history matrix and put the ancient history data through the history matrix. And what it shows is that if ancient history and history had the same cohort profile, the predicted grade distribution would suggest that the same percentage of students would gain a grade 7 and above in both history and ancient history, and slightly more would be getting a grade 4 and above in ancient history. So I think there's no evidence at all to suggest that it's like any harder to get particular grades in GCSE Ancient History in comparison to history. So I think this is the last slide from me. So if you do require sort of like any more information, please do give me a ring. The telephone number there is for our customer support centre. But if you have a subject specific question that they can't answer, you'll get put through to me. Alternatively, you can email into the classics@ocr.org.uk email address. You can either tweet me as well. Bonnie had that at the opening slides as well. And I'd also recommend signing up to our termly newsletter that give sort of information about sort of like CPD that we're offering and other third parties, any updates to sort of like resourcing or specifications that certainly would be interesting. So I'd recommend signing up to that. And sort of if there are sort of like anything that I can do to help support you in perhaps making that case to senior leadership in terms of sort of statistics, nearby centres, such like, please do get in touch with me, and I'm very, very happy to help.
Great. Thank you ever so much, Alex. I mean, that was such a thorough run through of what the GCSE entails and the different types of assessment. And I think helpfully showing how it is similar to the way that history is taught and assessed. That brings our webinar series to a close. Now's the chance to ask any questions that you might have about anything that Alex has covered today, or perhaps anything that has cropped up in previous sessions. Please do leave any questions that you have in the chat. Much like Alex, I'm also very happy for you to contact me directly, and we can put you in touch with other local schools that might be teaching similar modules or that might be willing to share resources with you. As I said, we've got a very welcoming ancient history community that will help you in your endeavours to get ancient history into schools. And please do look out for the upcoming CPD, not just with OCR, but with the Classical Association and with the Historical Association. We will do all we can to support schools that are new to entering students for ancient history. Unless there are, thanks Alex, unless there are any final questions, which there don't seem to be, I don't think, it just leaves me to thank Alex today for all of his excellent efforts in presenting, and thanks also to Steve and to Rich for joining us. That is all. That is the end of our collaborative series with the HA. And like I said, if there's anything that we can do to support you, please do get in touch. Thank you.